So it's the first morning of Gemini Sun. Day hasn't broke yet. I'm going to talk about Gemini from the perspective of somebody that's standing between the two columns. If you're a Mason, you'll blow a load over that and you'll know what I'm talking about. If you're some level of occultist, you'll blow a load and you'll know what I'm talking about. And if you've put it to practice, you'll know what I'm talking about. Buddha was born in Taurus. He's the master of non-duality. Tree consciousness. You're there to be a bridge, not to speak, to listen, to mitigate, flow, accept, and take on the darkness and turn it into light. That's experiential. That's every Taurus sun. Buddha, however, conditions his mind to see the machine where we see clouds and skies and grasses. He sees a wheel turning, a condition, cyclical, evasive, hard to catch, hard to hold. This might sound familiar to somebody who has a friend who knows something about Gemini. I know you've seen it as much as I have. Everybody loves to hate Gemini. Could it be, let me guess. Let's play a game called Gemini Keywords. Here's a cute catchphrase that I saw an occultist write once as their signature. May the snake continue to eat its own tail. Bravo. Clap, clap. Who would have guessed that you could dress up so nicely? Snakish behavior. And that's the game they play. If you ever heard Peanuts for the Peanut Gallery, the show must go on. There's more. These are all Gemini phrases designed to keep you entertained within the matrix. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if Cypher had some type of Gemini in him to betray Neo and crew. Now be sure this is one side of the Gemini coin. The show must go on. The fool must play the fool. And I think his secret message is never throw pearls to swine. That's the big part of wearing the mask of Gemini, is that secrecy is best. Moving in silence is good. Don't say what you want, but listen to what's needed and say what's needed. Say as little as possible. Of course, people born under Gemini seldom learn that. And that's about that. But so it's important to understand Gemini as a sign of continuity. You could think of it as the Ouroboros. You could think of it as the figure 8 infinity symbol. Wherever you see the figure 8 is where you see Gemini. A natural way to see Gemini, a balanced, fair way, is rhythm. A fair way. We start our day before we know it. We're hitting the sidewalks, going into the city, or going into our work. We move in between, and we weave between sidewalk and store or building. And there's a rhythm to it and a pulse. So the goddess of rhythm is the moon. And the element, the metal, that corresponds to her is silver. And the metal that corresponds to Mercury is quicksilver, which is silver in its liquid form. And this is important because Mercury becomes an arm of the moon. It's more flexible, more adaptable. It's about pacing and adjustment, bobbing and weaving, threading, and synchronous moving. So, anywhere you see this, you see Gemini. As a pessimist, you can see Gemini in the quote-unquote rat race, the day in, day out, the crowd shuffling. And on the spiritual side, we can see or sense and become aware of the rhythm and interplay between center and circumference, or self and other, or internal and external, or man and source. and we can develop a sense for the heartbeat, so to speak, in that spiritual relationship. Complementing Pisces in a sense as a planet that establishes energy. In fact, you can think of Pisces as the dynamis, and you can think of the dynamis as needing a harness around it, the same way that oil needs an oil rig, or that something to that effect, is a good way to think of it. The relationship of Pisces to Gemini, where Gemini acts as the harness, the two pistons that harness the energy, the unbridled energy of Jupiter, the thunder god. So, in fact, you can think of an interesting correspondence that the legs correspond to Sagittarius and Jupiter, and the lungs correspond to Gemini and Mercury. Now, the interesting thing is the legs act interdependently. They alternate like pistons. One leg moves in front, the other follows. It's like tracing or an echo. So you would think that Mercury would rule the legs, because Mercury is this piston movement, this alternating movement. Interestingly enough, the lungs seem to move codependently or synchronously. They're two that move as one. Hopefully I've given you an idea or a hint of the interconnection between these sibling planets or opposite forces. You might not know that Sagittarius and Gemini are opposite signs. So when I speak about their planets, I hope that from now on you understand that I'm speaking about this sibling relationship. That there's kind of a shadow of Gemini, so to speak, in the legs, and a shadow of Sagittarius in the lungs. Now, earlier I brought up the Buddha. In relation to his spiritual teachings. Mercury shares and Gemini shares a part of these teachings, in essence. Specifically, anatta, anicca, and dukkha. Those three concepts roughly translate to emptiness, suffering, and impermanence. Recall what I just said about Mercury and Gemini. Recall that the snake eats its own tail. Compare that to suffering and dissatisfaction, longing, being so hungry. It's like a dog chasing its tail, to the degree that the dog is willing to deny reality and create an illusion of separation to fulfill the impulse and the emotion of chase, the excitement of chase. So you'll see that the Buddha, even though he was born under Taurus, is already speaking to the construct of mind that is in the preceding sign, Gemini. So, impermanence is the same thing. And as somebody who's a fellow human being, meaning somebody sharing this universal experience, together, of the sun being in Gemini, you get the pleasure of being denied your impulses, of being shuttered away. Otherwise, falling victim to thirst traps, falling victim to excitement and attachment. It's like a hunter leading you on with a bait that you can just never catch. Your emotions will get worked up, just enough to keep you invested. And that's the figure eight. That's the peanuts for the peanut gallery. That's the gladiator fight for the Colosseum. And that's the game. And that's what you fall victim to under Gemini. Under the sun in Gemini specifically, because the sun represents challenges. So, the challenge is to live under the principles that the Buddha taught. Non-attachment, non-resistance, compassion. You're not meant to, as much as it might seem like you're being pulled in the direction of your desires, you're not meant to attain them. It's an illusion. You're meant to be balanced and objective, and you're meant to deny self and give up to the divine will, so to speak. So going back to the relationship of Sagittarius to Gemini, it's interesting because being the thunder god and bearing the responsibility of two signs, Pisces and Sagittarius, you're bearing the weight and the burden of impulse. People should know that Sagittarius is a mythological figure. It is the centaur, part man, part beast. Horse. It's the horse nature. So people under Jupiter or Sagittarius, especially when they're young, express the vanity of the ego. Everything's an impulse. Everything's a rush. Everything's a drive. Everything's an exclusion. Everything's a blind eye. For a misaligned Sagittarius. Everything's judged according to impulse. And this excludes a lot of the mystery of life. This is the sad trade-off for a fire sign. That it can be the light, but it can't coexist with the darkness the way that Saturn can. And so it misses out on a lot of the mysteries of life, the potentials that lie in shadow and depth. And to the extent that they live this egoism and this vanity, this is the extent to which they confuse impulse and reality. Impulse and reality thread, and so they fall under the responsibility of Mercury. And this is the application of the lungs to the heart system, where the nature of the heart itself is to be a center, a centerless center, and to permit itself to live for others, for it to flow through others. The lungs act like the pistons, and they act like the processing force. So you can imagine the air element as a scroll, and that scroll has to pass through the lungs. It has to be processed from unrefined element into intellect. It's a scroll that has to be translated. So the simulation of this applies to the soul and the soul's ability to translate the objectivity or the fact, the intellectual substance in emotional encounters. So in other words, Gemini and the lungs function to allow people to process intellect from emotion. So think to Sagittarius and its misalignment, its preference for impulse over objectivity and patience. And you'll see that to the extent that the Sagittarian nature does this is the extent to which we turn Mercury, the force of threading, into a malefic force of disorganization. This is why Mercury doesn't function under Sagittarius or Pisces, the Jupiter signs. So this is important as a way of revealing the interconnectivity of these two sibling signs. So that's about it. In conclusion, since the sun is in Gemini, we have to live under the principles of the Buddha, not to give in to our emotional temptations, not to be lured by desire like a hunter lures a prey with bait. And to recognize that this is a condition of Gemini and that we'll be susceptible to it. Not to be led by our hearts, but to be led by reason in the face of adversity. The idea isn't to seek the fulfillment of desire or happiness, but to fulfill the contractual obligation to maturity, to level up, so to speak, to go boss mode, so to speak, to suffer with dignity.